As the last part in this section, let's talk about how Node.js modules actually work behind the scenes. So first of all, in a Node.js module system, each JavaScript file is treated as a separate module. And we already played around a bit with modules in the intro section, especially by using the require function and exporting data from modules. And so that's the fundamentals of common JS modules, which is the module system that Node uses, because it works especially well on the server. Now, there's also the native ECMAScript or ES module system that you might already be familiar with, especially if you took my complete JavaScript course or if you have been writing JavaScript on the front end lately. And this ES module system that I was talking about was developed to work in the browser using the import-export syntax. So I just wanted to make it clear that these are two different module systems that you will see in different situations, so don't be confused. There have also been attempts to implement native ES modules in Node.js, especially using file extensions like .mjs, but so far it's not really become a popular thing to use. And so unless you're watching this course in the far future, you will probably always be using the common JS system with Node. Now, you might be wondering why in Node.js each and every module actually gets access to the require function in order to import modules in the first place, right? I mean, it's not a standard JavaScript function, so where does it come from? And how exactly does it work behind the scenes? Well, let's find out. So the question here is, what happens each time that we require a module by calling the require function with the module name as the argument? So as a very broad overview, the following steps are executed behind the scenes. First, the path to the required module is resolved and the file is loaded. Then a process called wrapping happens. After that, the module code is executed and the module exports are returned. And finally, the entire module gets cached. Alright, so let's now look at each step in more detail. So first off, how does Node know which file to load when we require a module? Because remember, we can actually load three different kinds of modules. Node's core modules, our own modules, or third-party modules from NPM, like Express, which is the Node framework that we're going to use throughout most of the course. So this process is known as resolving the file path, and here is how it works. When the require function receives the module name as its input, it will first try to load a core module with that name, like for example the HTTP module. It will automatically find the path to that module and then load it. Now, if the path starts with a dot or two dot, it means that it's a developer module, because we indicate the relative path to our file. So Node will try to load that file, but if there is no file with that name, well, then it will look for a folder instead and load index.js if it's in that folder. So in this example, it will try to load lib/controller.js. Remember that we can drop the .js when requiring a module. In case there is no file at this path, it will then instead try to open index.js from the lib/controller folder instead. Make sense? And finally, if the required module is neither a core module nor a developer module, Node will assume it's a module from NPM. And remember, on a module that we load from NPM, we actually don't need to write the path when we require it. Just the module name, just the way it works on a core module. So these third-party modules are stored in the Node modules folder, and so Node will step into that folder and try to find the module there, and then load it. And of course, if the file can't be found anywhere, then an error is thrown and the execution of the app is stopped. Alright, moving on, after the module is loaded, the module's code is wrapped into a special function, which will give us access to a couple of special objects. And so this step is where the magic happens. It is here where we get the answer to the question, where does the require function actually come from, and why do we have access to it? Well, it's because the Node.js runtime takes the code of our module and puts it inside the immediately invoked function expression, or IFI, that you can see here. So Node does actually not directly execute the code that we write into a file, but instead the wrapper function that will contain our code in its body. It also passes the exports, require, module, file name, and dir name objects into it. And so that is why in every module we automatically have access to stuff like the require function. So these are basically like global variables that are injected into each and every module. Okay? Now, by doing this, Node achieves two very important things. First, of course, is giving developers access to all these variables we just talked about, which is very helpful. And second, it keeps the top-level variables that we define in our modules private, so scoped only to the current module, instead of leaking everything into the global object. So imagine for a second that we declared a variable x in one of our modules, and then included an npm module that also used a variable called x. Without this mechanism, our own variable would then get overwritten, and the entire app would just not work. So each module having its private scope is absolutely crucial, and is achieved through this clever trick of wrapping our code into this special function. Alright, so let's now take a quick look at each object that our module gets. First, the require function, which we already know about. Then there is a module object, which is just a reference to the current module, and which for us is most important when it comes to exporting data. The same applies to the exports object, which we're going to discuss in a moment. Finally, there are the convenience variables file name and dir name, which simply contain the absolute path to the current module's file as well as the current directory name. And that is how the wrapping step of loading a module works. Next up, the code in the module, or to be more precise, in the module's wrapper function, actually gets executed by the Node.js runtime. So nothing fancy here. Alright, so up until this point, the require function has been called with a module name as the argument, the path to the module's file has been resolved and the file loaded, all the code has been wrapped into the wrapper function, which has then been executed. And so now it's time for the require function to actually return something. And what it returns is the exports of the required module. These exports are stored in the module.exports object. Alright? It might look a little bit like this. So again, in each module we can export variables, which will in the end be returned by the require function. And we do that by assigning variables to module.exports or simply to exports, which is just a pointer to module.exports. We will do this in practice in the next video because I know this sounds kind of confusing when I just say it like this. Anyway, here is what you need to know about when to use module.exports or just exports. So if all you want to do is to export one single variable, like one class or one function, you usually use module.exports and set it equal to the variable that you want to export, just like in this example. On the other hand, if you're looking to export multiple named variables, like multiple functions for example, then you should create these as properties of the export object. For example, if we were doing a calculator module, you could create exports.add, exports.multiply, exports.divide, and so on and so forth. Make sense? Again, we're going to do this in the next video, and it will make more sense to you by then. Okay, and this is effectively how we export and import data from one module into the other. Of course, this is also why we usually assign the result of a require function call to a new variable, so that we can save the returned exports. And now just to finish this video real quick, the last step is that modules are actually cached after the first time they are loaded. What this means is that if you require the same module multiple times, you will always get the same result, and the code in the modules is actually only executed in the first call. In subsequent calls, the result is then simply retrieved from cache. Perfect! So I hope that all the logic behind how to work with modules doesn't really look like magic anymore. It's really important to know how all of this works in order to become a great, and above all, a more independent Node.js developer.